The sky above London on April 5th, 1531, was a bleak, foreboding grey, as if the very heavens were mirroring the dark events about to unfold. The air was thick with a sense of dread. A crowd, a strange mix of the curious and the horrified, had gathered at Smithfield, a place typically known for executions and bustling cattle fairs. But today, the spectacle was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. In the center of the square, an enormous bronze cauldron sat simmering over a crackling fire. A gasp rippled through the onlookers as guards brought forward a man, his hands bound. His name was Richard Roose, a cook in the service of Bishop John Fisher. His face, pale and stricken with terror, was fixed on the brutal instrument of his coming death. He was to be boiled alive. He would face an excruciating end, his skin slowly dissolving in the scalding water. Transition to a shot of a historical painting of Henry VIII, looking stern and powerful. The music becomes more dramatic. How did a simple cook come to such a terrible fate? To understand this macabre tale, we must rewind the clock a few weeks. The year was 1531, and England was in the midst of a political and religious storm. King Henry VIII was obsessed with annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. This desire had split the kingdom. On one side were ambitious courtiers who supported the king's will, while on the other were conservative clerics who believed marriage was a sacred and unbreakable vow. Among these staunch opponents was John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. A man of profound religious conviction, Fisher had earned the enmity not only of King Henry, but also of the powerful Boleyn family, who saw him as the primary obstacle to their ambitions. Fisher lived in constant fear for his life. He took extraordinary precautions, sleeping in a different room each night and being meticulously careful about what he ate and drank. As it turned out, his paranoia was far from unfounded. Transition to a shot of a bustling kitchen in a grand old building. The sounds of clanging pots and pans can be heard. At the bishop's residence in Lambeth, south of London, Richard Roose worked as a cook. He was an ordinary, middle-aged man, unremarkable in every way, blending in with the numerous servants who kept the great houses running. There was no reason to suspect him until February 18th. That afternoon, Bishop Fisher hosted a dinner for his guests. On the menu was a thick soup, a common dish of the era. While preparing the meal, Roose secretly added a mysterious powder to the food. He would later claim that he believed it was a simple purgative, meant only to cause some intestinal distress, a cruel prank, but not a lethal one. According to his story, he had no idea of its true power. The bishop, perhaps lacking an appetite, ate very little of the soup. However, other guests consumed more. Transition to a scene of a busy street, with beggars waiting for food. A plate of soup is handed to a beggar. After the meal, the leftover food was distributed to beggars who had come seeking alms, a common practice at the time. Among them were two humble souls, Bennet Kerwin and Alice Triet, who were overjoyed at their unexpected stroke of luck. But hours later, the horror began. All who had eaten the soup were struck with excruciating abdominal pains, vomiting, cold sweats, and convulsions. Bishop Fisher survived, having ingested so little of the poison. Other guests became gravely ill, but Bennet and Alice, who had eagerly devoured their portions, were not so fortunate. Their bodies were found the next day, contorted in agony. Transition to a close-up shot of a newspaper headline from the period, reporting the poisoning. The camera zooms out to show Henry VIII looking furious. News of the poisoning spread like wildfire. King Henry VIII, upon hearing of the incident, was absolutely furious. Despite his personal animosity toward Fisher, this attack threatened the very foundation of the monarchy itself. If a bishop could be poisoned so easily, what guarantee of safety did the king himself have? The king immediately ordered an investigation. Richard Roose, who was attempting to flee London, was quickly captured and taken to the Tower of London. There he was subjected to the rack, a gruesome torture device that stretched a person's limbs to their breaking point. Under this agonizing pain, Roose confessed to adding the powder to the soup, though he continued to insist he believed it was a harmless purgative. Transition to a shot of an old Parliament chamber. Henry VIII is standing before the assembly, gesturing angrily. The case took an unprecedented turn. On February 28th, Henry VIII himself appeared before Parliament, an extraordinary move for the era, to report the crime. He declared the poisoning to be an act of high treason, not just against Bishop Fisher, but against the crown itself. Parliament, always eager to appease the king, swiftly approved the Act for Poisoning, a law that classified poisoning as high treason and established a specific and horrific punishment, death by boiling. This fact is worth noting. Henry VIII not only determined Rose's guilt without a proper trial, but he also retroactively created a law and a punishment specifically for him. The penalty for treason was already a terrible fate. The condemned was dragged by horses, hanged until nearly dead, castrated, and quartered alive. But the king wanted something more. He wanted a punishment that mirrored the horror of poisoning, a slow, agonizing death where the criminal would feel his body progressively cook. Transition to a shot of a busy Smithfield Square on the day of the execution. Vendors are selling food and drinks, people are pushing to get a better view. Why such a cruel, personal involvement from the king in a case involving a mere cook and a bishop who wasn't even his ally? The motives were never fully clarified. Some historians believe Henry had a genuine phobia of poisoning, seeing it as the most cowardly of all deaths. Others, more skeptical, see complex political motivations at play. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuys, a confidant of Fisher, suggested that the king acted so vehemently to divert suspicion from himself, or at least from Anne Boleyn and her family. This theory is not without merit. Rumors had been circulating that the Boleyn family had hired Rose to eliminate Fisher, a major obstacle to the king's marriage plans. Rose's swift and brutal execution could have been a way to end any deeper investigation that might have implicated those close to the crown. Whatever the truth, Richard Rose's fate was sealed. His execution was set for April 5th. Such an unusual event drew massive crowds to Smithfield. People pushed and shoved for a good view, and vendors sold food and drinks, treating it like a theatrical spectacle rather than the atrocious end of a human being. Transition to a shot of the great cauldron, bubbling fiercely. The guards are bringing a man forward. The great bronze cauldron was already bubbling when Roose was brought forward. Some accounts suggest he was given alcohol to partially sedate him, a final small act of mercy. The guards stripped him and lifted him above the cauldron as a priest offered a quick prayer, giving him absolution for his sins but no relief for his body. What followed was one of the most horrifying executions ever recorded in English history. 3 times Roose was immersed into the boiling water. On the first dip, only his legs were submerged. His screams of agony echoed across the square as the skin of his lower limbs separated from the flesh. Some in the crowd fainted, while others turned away, unable to bear the sight. On the second dip, his torso was lowered into the water up to his chest. The water, which had been clear, now acquired a pinkish hue as it dissolved his flesh. His screams were no longer human. They became indistinct gurgles as he fought for air. On the third and final dip, Richard Roose was fully immersed in the boiling water. Death, though horrible, finally freed him from his torment. Transition to a shot of a historical document, mentioning the abolition of this form of punishment. Rose's execution, tragically, was not an isolated case. Thanks to the new law, others convicted of poisoning would face the same fate. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davies was boiled alive at Smithfield for allegedly poisoning 3 households where she had worked. This brutal method of execution was officially abolished during the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, as part of reforms to limit the most barbaric punishments. What makes Richard Roose's case so disturbing is not just the brutality of his punishment, but the complex political circumstances that surrounded it. He was a victim of a volatile time, a moment when England stood on the brink of monumental religious and political changes. The very man he was accused of trying to kill, John Fisher, would not escape his own tragic end. 4 years later, in 1535, Fisher was executed for refusing to recognize Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. His head was displayed on London Bridge until it became unrecognizable. Anne Boleyn, whose rise to the throne was indirectly related to Rose's case, would not have a happy ending either. In 1536, just 5 years after these events, she herself was executed on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason to allow Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. And as for Henry VIII, he would continue his turbulent reign for another 16 years, marrying 4 more women, completely breaking with Rome, and transforming England into a Protestant country. His paranoia and brutality only grew with age, leaving a trail of blood that would forever mark English history. Transition to a modern-day shot of Smithfield Market, bustling with people and traffic. The camera pans over the crowd, a stark contrast to the historical scenes. Today, the site where Richard Roose met his terrible end is a busy commercial centre. There is no plaque, no monument to remember the horrors that took place there centuries ago. Few Londoners passing through Smithfield today know that beneath their feet, a man was once slowly boiled alive in a bronze cauldron. The story of Richard Roose offers us a disturbing glimpse into the past. It reminds us of a time when justice and cruelty went hand in hand, when the powerful could literally rewrite laws to satisfy their whims, and when the value of a human life was determined by the political utility of their death. It is impossible to know for certain if Roose was truly guilty, a mere scapegoat for a larger conspiracy, or if he simply made a tragic mistake. What we know with certainty is that his punishment far exceeded any sense of justice, even by the brutal standards of his time. Closing shot. A slow zoom on the ground at Smithfield, with the sound of a faint, distant scream. The music swells slightly, then fades out. Execution by boiling, a death that recreated the very act of cooking, carried a macabre irony that cannot be ignored. The man whose life was dedicated to preparing food in cauldrons ended his days as an ingredient in one. It was a terrible, poetic vengeance, designed to satisfy a sense of retributive justice in a brutal era. 5 centuries have passed since that grey April afternoon. Our justice systems, though imperfect, now seek rehabilitation rather than retribution. Our laws are supposed to apply equally to the powerful and the common person. Our punishments, even for the most heinous crimes, no longer include deliberate torture. Nevertheless, the story of Richard Roose, the man who was boiled alive, continues to fascinate us. It shows us how thin the line is that separates civilization from barbarism, and how institutions meant to protect citizens can so easily become instruments of terror when manipulated by those in power. Under the hurried feet of modern Londoners, the echoes of the past still resonate. And if we listen carefully, perhaps we can still hear the screams of a cook who, on a grey April day in 1531, discovered in the most terrible way what it means to be on the other side of the cauldron.